And we're live for another Explain Me Like I'm Five. I'm here with Will Tanner. Will, how you doing?
Doing well. What about you?
Doing good. Ready to learn about Rhodesia.
Wonderful.
I only found out about it because all the Twitter memes and that one movie was like what's his name?
Leonardo DiCaprio.
Yeah, Leonardo DiCaprio was like, I'm from Rhodesia. Yeah. Like that guy sounds cool, and the movie was cool. So I was in a reason I decided to do the podcast actually was I was in a black diaspora bookstore, and they had a whole giant book on Rhodesia that I bought, and I started reading. I'm like, this guy's a total lib and making it sound awful. I don't think my right wing friends on Twitter would say memes about this if this book was accurate. I got to get an expert on.
Right.
But so before we get into all the questions, how did you come to know about Rhodesia? How did you become like? When I ask anybody who's like, get on for Rhodesia, Pete Canone was like, got to get Will. People are saying you. So how did you come to be known as the Rhodesia guy? And how did you find out about Rhodesia? What's your story here?
Oh, yeah. So it's somewhat convoluted. So when I was like 12-ish, I thought I had read one random book about Blackwater, the private military contracting company that I just picked up at a Barnes & Noble because it looked cool. And I was like, oh, this is the coolest company ever. And the guy writing it tried to make it look like just the worst thing you can imagine. But he made it pretty cool, I thought. So I was like, I want to learn more about this Eric Prince guy. So then around that time was when Eric Prince's book, Civilian Warriors, came out, or Citizen Warriors or something, which was pretty good. But through it, I got interested in Soldier of Fortune magazine, which was like more famous back in the day than it used to be, but it was really a big thing kind of after the Vietnam War. So late 70s to 80s. And one of the things that the founder of it did, Robert K. Brown, was he went to Rhodesia and he'd smuggle guns through his local airport to the Rhodesian farmers who needed them. They really liked the Ruger Mini 14s, he said. And I happened to know that because around the same time I was reading about Prince, Dancing with Devils, which is Robert K. Brown's memoir, came out. And it's pretty good. It's kind of like Eric Prince's, but it was entertaining. And there was a good bit of it devoted to Rhodesia. And I was like, well, this sounds like the coolest country ever. Right? These guys are like heavily outnumbered fighting communists. And they did it for 15 years while kicking ass. And had it not been for what looks like just idiotic trade restrictions, they probably would have won. So kind of knew about it in my teenage years, but then put it on the back burner because there's all the Trump stuff, and then I went to college and then law school and just kind of was busy with stuff. But then once I was wrapping up law school, I had a Twitter account and figured I'd start posting. I was like, well, I don't really see anyone posting about this Rhodesia thing, and I remember it interested me when I was reading about it. So I found Ian Smith's biography, which has been republished once, but under the name Bitter Harvest, but it was originally called The Great Betrayal. And I read that and I was like, well, this really is a great betrayal. This is just ridiculous. So I started writing about it on Twitter. Yeah. And then
I saw an interview with Ian Smith on Firing Line with Wilmeth Buckley, and I'm like, this guy is making perfect sense. It was so refreshing to hear someone say like again, I'm not a big democracy guy, but it was so refreshing to hear someone go, we're gonna have a democracy, but we have to have an evolution of the voters, not a revolution. I'm like, makes so much sense. It's just refreshing to hear someone make an argument. Everyone defends democracy, defends this, everyone has to vote all the time. It was just nice to hear someone go, no, we can have it. Only people who are competent should vote. I'm like, that's just nice to hear.
Yeah, it makes sense.
It really does, especially when you drive around any town nowadays. You look at people, you're like, man, these guys can vote.
Yeah, it's bleak,
insane. But so let's get into this. What's the history of it? How did Rhodesia get founded? Who founded it? Where does it come from? All that kind of stuff.
Yeah, so it was founded by Cecil Rhodes, who's a famous promoter of the British Empire and really turned it into what it was in the late imperial period. He famously wanted a railroad to go from the Cape, so South Africa, to Cairo in Egypt, which meant traversing Africa entirely, all the way through the vertical plane, which he almost succeeded in doing. It got kind of rough in the middle, so it wasn't quite a success, but almost. But to do it, and as they were building it, he knew they needed to control Rhodesia, which wasn't called that then. It was this patch of land to the north of South Africa that no one had really settled. The Boers had kind of touched on its borders when they went north in the 1840-ish Great Trek when they were leaving British rule. But no one really went there. There were some African tribes there, but not a ton of people. and it looked like good land. But then the real impetus to make it happen, because such things are expensive, was the discovery of huge amounts of gold and diamonds in South Africa. Really, the Rand gold mines are a turning point for what became Rhodesia, because up till then, there wasn't a huge reason to settle it. But then they found all this gold in South Africa. And so Rhodes thought, well, maybe we'll find more gold in South Africa, so I can put together a company that will fund a venture that goes to settle it, which is one thing that attracted me to it, because it's much like Virginia, where the Virginia company thought, well, the Spaniards found all that gold down Mexico, so maybe we can find some in Virginia. And they didn't. Nor did the British South Africa Company, which put together the Pioneer Column, which was interesting because it kind of it indicated where the direction Rhodesia would go from there, because unlike what you might imagine from a late imperial venture to take over this area by private force, it wasn't really a collection like a rogues gallery. There were a bunch of freebooters and scalawags and all that. Rather, it was people who they came from across the classes, lower, middle, upper, but they weren't like they weren't pirates. They were more just like normal British people who wanted to do something interesting.
It sounds like a parallel to the people who started going across the from Spain in the early Americas. You know, the Aztecs, the conquistadors. You know, just all across the spectrum. They were just going over trying to get some money, start a new life, or just bring money back to their families.
Right. Yeah. It's an interesting comparison to the settling of America, particularly some of the Anglo colonies, because what happened was they got there, and there were some tribes there, the Shona and the Matabele or Ndebele. The Ndebele were very welcoming to Anglo settlement, and in exchange for that, they got alliance. The Shona, not so much, but at first, at least. So then what happened was they were prospecting, and they found a little bit of gold. They still have gold mines in Zimbabwe, but it wasn't really enough to justify settlement of the whole area, which now is Zambia and Zimbabwe, were at one point all of the Federation of Rhodesia, of Northern and Southern Rhodesia for Zambia and Rhodesia respectively. So Southern Rhodesia is what I call Rhodesia, but it was the whole area at first. And they found some gold, but not enough. So they decided, well, it is this pretty fertile farmland, and there's next to no one here. So why not bring in a great deal of farmers, because we have people who want to leave England to farm, and we'll set up shop in Rhodesia and start farming. So the British South Africa Company did that. It was a company-ruled colony until the early 1920s. And as they did it, they realized, well, and I'm sure this was articulated beforehand, but unlike England, where you have 2 millennia of pretty intense agricultural settlement, and because of that, you have all these small farms with kind of rocky walls that are hard to remove, where agriculture is inefficient. No one has ever farmed Rhodesia on a grand scale. The people are using sticks to try and dig little holes to put seeds in. We have steam-powered tractors. We can do this better. So that led to the creation of these huge agricultural estates where it's like 10,000 acres, and you can just go from horizon to horizon with a tractor and farm it successfully and grow tobacco, which is what they did. And through a lot of the country, really a central spine, but larger than just a mountain range. It's a large patch of territory. The climate is quite hospitable, kind of like the highlands of Kenya or Uganda. It was like England at its best, very temperate, but also good for growing stuff. So it brought in a lot of settlers, which caused issues, because at that point, the Matabele were somewhat upset over what they saw as British encroachment, as were the Shona. So there's this big war that kind of occurred right before the Second Anglo-Boer War did. And the British, of course, won because they had the Maxim gun and the Africans did not. Which led to the creation of really Rhodesia as a colony that was using the natives for labor, but not so much reliant on treaties with the king. And that's where you get this explosion in growth as more settlers move in, more farms are made, etc. So a lot like Virginia in that respect.
Okay. Now, later Rhodesia, when you post-World War II stuff, how were they economically? A lot of exports? Were they importing a lot of stuff? Was it a breadbasket? Was a lot of tobacco being sipped out of there? What was it? Were they economically feasible? Like not feasible. Solvent? Were they solid? Were they relying on debts? Like how were they economically?
No, so it was very prosperous. I'm sure some debt was involved, but debt was never an issue for Rhodesia like it became for Zimbabwe, nor is inflation. They kept parity with their currency the whole time, even during the Bush War. What happened was really after they became independent of company rule in 1921, and then kind of up through World War II. More agricultural settlers came in, but they had a very strict immigration policy. So quite in contrast to, say, America or Argentina, where just like a bunch of South and Central Europeans poured in, and there was kind of hostility because of that, and the lack of assimilation for a few decades. Rhodesia, from the start, really, even with the pioneer column, said, well, we only want guys who are going to really assimilate and become part of Rhodesian culture. And Rhodesian culture was interesting because, and there's a guy on Twitter named Rory Duncan who had my show recently, and he explained this well. Yes, not all that many people who moved there were aristocrats in Britain, but some of the aristocrats did move there. The Earl, or the Duke of Montrose, for one, who became part of Ian Smith's government, which is only important in that there was a group of aristocrats who were there and who had brought their money with them because there are extremely high death taxes in Britain at this period, and they wanted to avoid that. So you get this influx of capital because it's the aristocrats doing that, but then also the middle class that wants to buy up farms, and to some extent the working class that wanted to buy up farms. So the people who come in are people who are going to integrate and assimilate into that culture and are almost entirely from Britain, though some were Boers from South Africa. So it's interesting because you get this mix of kind of people from across the social classes in Britain who, once they're in Rhodesia, there's some of that privileged, genteel life, for lack of a better word, like clubs where they go drink during the day and have Africans serve them. And they have these large agricultural estates that are kind of humming along. And that's not everywhere in the country. Alexandria Fuller, in her book, Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight, kind of shows the lower to lower middle class aspects of some of it in the worse farming territory. But along the central spine, that's pretty true. So you have these big estates that are quite good at growing tobacco, which until the war was their main crop. It wasn't so much grain until that changed during the war. It was tobacco, and they exported it. And in exchange for the export, which also included some minerals, there's like, I think cobalt is in Rhodesia, some minerals like that, some gold. They would import the things they needed, weapons, for example, but also industrial machinery, because they were becoming an industrial society, not anywhere near to the extent of America or even South Africa, but they did have an industrial sector that was pretty successful. And so that's kind of where they are at the end of World War II. They don't know what's going to happen with the British Empire, though they chose to remain part of the Commonwealth, which later came back to bite them. But they were successful, they were prosperous, and it wasn't a sclerotic, debt-ridden society, nor was it an overtaxed or overregulated one. It had an Anglo government, which more than the American government, I think, regulated some, but there weren't 9% taxes in Rhodesia like there were in Britain. It was a pretty functional place that was doing well. It was very much on the ascent in the 40s, and the people it was bringing in were people who wanted to be in Rhodesia and would be good Rhodesians and kind of fit into its very unique culture.
What was the at this point? What was like the racial makeup of it? You know, what was the percentages of whites versus the Africans who were there? What were the different kind of tribes that were moving in? What was the makeup of the whole area?
Yeah, so there weren't really tribes that were moving in. The two tribes that existed beforehand, the Ndebele or Matabele and the Shona, were still there, and they exploded in number as European medicine and kind of farming techniques allowed them to do so. So I don't know what the population mix was in the 40s. In the 60s, kind of around the time the Bush War began in 65, there were about 250,000-ish white Rhodesians, nearly all of whom were from Britain or were Anglo descent, born in Rhodesia. And then there were about 7 to 9 million Africans. They live in tribal villages, so it's somewhat difficult to count them, but probably like 7 to 9 million, towards the 9 million range. So 250 and 9 million.
Okay. So you already talked about it a little bit, but kind of let's go in a bit more detail. What was it like before the Anglo came? You know, it was just, kind of scattered tribes, not a lot of farmland, like you said. What were they fight with the two tribes that were there, the Sona and the Matabele? Have you pronounced it? Were they fighting? Were they peaceful? Was it a war? Was it a violent area? Or was it kind of just like chill, or it's as chill as you can be pre-industrialization?
So to some extent, it's hard to know exactly what happened because they didn't really leave a written record, which is kind of a problem across Africa. So in northern South Africa, which I'm not sure if this territory is still part of South Africa today, but like Natal and that region, what the Boers found as they moved north was that kind of before they got there, there'd been this titanic, just cataclysmic conflict between the African tribes that wiped out, I think, somewhere in the range of like half to 60% of the natives. I could be wrong on those numbers, but it was over 30%. It was just cataclysmic. It was somewhat like the 30 Years' War. But in Africa, and no one really knows what happened that much, other than that they kind of fought. More north into what became Rhodesia, I think you got some of that. There was fighting. There wasn't. There was some agriculture as well. They're very primitive agriculture and a lot of like cattle herding type stuff. So kind of like the pastoralists that were in South Africa as the Boers settled it, but not quite, is what I gather. A little bit more sedentary with more villages, but it was a mix. And the two main tribes, the Shona and the Matabele, didn't like each other and fought. The Matabele were somewhat more powerful, and I think they oppressed the Shona, but I could have that backwards. They were kind of at each other's throats. But I believe it was the Matabele king who was more powerful and kind of had his sandal or foot on the neck of the Shona, and allowed the pioneer column to come in exchange for weapons so that he could continue doing so.
Well, based on that information, would you say it would be fair to say it was definitely improved by the Anglos coming in?
Yes, okay. Very much so.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to get that out there because people will say like, "Oh, the white man came and ruined everything." You know, they were living in tribal paradises, and it's like I doubt it. I don't know the information. No one really does. Like you said, there was a lot of information was destroyed. They didn't really write anything down, but I doubt it. Given what we know about what we do know, it seemed less likely to be like the way people try to paint the Aztecs or something. You know, it's like it's living in peace and harmony. It's like, no, I don't believe that.
They were kind of in the Stone Age, but plus militarism, because militarism didn't really come to Europe until the Bronze Age with the Indo-Europeans. But in Africa, they had the mix of like Stone Age technology paired with like just vicious tribal conflict. So that's what was going on.
Brutal. Sounds very brutal.
Yeah.
So what was the main political divide going on there? Like how many of the like I heard the Ian Smith interview talking about when to do revolution. I mean, evolution, not revolution. And he made it sound like there were, Black Rhodesians who were assimilating, who were trying to succeed, move on up. What was the political divide like? Did Rhodesia have a liberal party or something that was trying to help one group, or was like what was the political makeup of the Rhodesia kind of like?
Yeah, so I don't want to understate it. There was a liberal element pretty much in every Anglo country, at least. Kind of since Napoleon or since the French Revolution, there's been a liberal element, really even before with the Whigs. But it wasn't large enough to compete with the Rhodesian Front, which was kind of the like nationalist conservative party. So there was a liberal element. One example is Alan Savory, who founded the Sella Scouts, which were a famous unit in the war, and also started the regenerative ranching movement, which is kind of becoming a big thing. He was more on the liberal side and disagreed with the Rhodesian Front's policies and left because of it, from what I gather. And so there are people like that who didn't really agree and kind of thought the Rhodesian Front was too harsh, so they left. But they were never a major political force. They didn't really win any seats in parliament because they didn't have a broad base of support. They were just kind of there. The blacks and the whites, it wasn't really that big of a divide. Of course, there was the communist insurrection, though a lot of the communists were from outside the country. Inside the country, there was no apartheid. There were some attempts at racial policy, but they got rid of that during the 50s, and it hadn't been a big thing before then. So by the time the Bush War breaks out in 65, the situation was that there's no apartheid. There weren't really racial restrictions in Rhodesia. Instead, they had a propertied voting system where to vote on the A list, which was really the one that decided national elections, you had to have the modern equivalent would be like $60,000-ish in 2024 currency. U.S. currency in Rhodesian properties. So whether it was a house, whether it was a farm, whether it was a Rhodesian business, that qualified and you could vote. It wasn't like you couldn't own like stock in Britain. I don't think it was like actually Rhodesian property.
Some stake in the land.
Yes, exactly. Because they wanted people, and this was the big Rhodesian thing. They weren't racialists really. They more wanted stewardship. They wanted a successful country, and they'd gotten that through white rule and would have gotten it with continued white rule. But they were willing to let the Africans into the political system as the Africans became capable and were able to be stewards. Which is an important distinction from South Africa, where there was this harsher apartheid policy that didn't really allow that, at least from what I gather. So what that meant was that there weren't really like hard split tensions inside Rhodesia. It wasn't like really even America during the civil rights fiasco. Instead, the tribal chiefs all supported Ian Smith. So when he chose to when he asked them whether they wanted to go along the path of their unilateral Declaration of Independence in 1965, really all the chiefs agreed with it, and the chiefs pretty much broadly represented the tribes that they represented towards them. So there was pretty broad African support for the government. The Rhodesian front was pretty much entirely white, I think. There were some Boers like P.K. Vanderbilt who were involved, but it was also mainly Anglo. At that, it meant that there was a pretty steady direction for Rhodesia. Just in terms of like what the government represented, it was this property. It was pretty much what you'd expect with a property voting system. They were like kind of conservative. They weren't crazy. They just wanted the country to succeed and to kind of continue on the path of prosperity and ordered liberty that it had been. So that was their thing. There weren't huge splits. It was pretty functional. Local elections were just decided by the people who lived there. There wasn't so much the a voter list issue. You didn't have to have that much property to vote in local elections. So those were just kind of left to the people who lived there, or in the case of tribes, kind of however the village wanted to handle it. And so there wasn't this just huge hostility. It wasn't anything like South Africa. It's kind of different in that respect.
You're painting a you know what distributism is, like the political philosophy of Hilaire Belloc or D.K. Chesterton?
Very vaguely.
Yeah. You're basically painting what sounds like a distributor's dream, basically. It sounds incredible. Okay, so one more question before we kind of get into the Bush War and all that kind of stuff. Ian Smith, in his interview with William F. Buckley, talked about an evolution rather than a revolution. What was the evolution looking like? Was it succeeding? Would it have succeeded given time? Was he just spitting hot air and kind of trying to justify things? Like, how was it looking?
Yeah, so there's a story, and I think it's in The Great Betrayal that gets to that. There was this long-term laborer servant on Ian Smith's property, and Ian Smith was a pretty large landowner. He was one of these. He didn't come from aristocratic stock, as the name Smith implies, but he was kind of like a genteel Rhodesian, as a lot of the big landowners were, just as you'd expect. And so there's this long-term servant on his family's farm that had been held for a few generations at this point, and the guy had been there for forever, so they cared about him. There's kind of the mutual affection. It's a black guy. And he had a toothache, and so they looked at it, and his tooth was obviously rotten or infected or something. So they're like, well, we have to go to the dentist to sort this out. And the guy was kind of skeptical, but they got him to the dentist. Once he was in the dentist chair, they're like, well, we're going to put you under so we can pull your tooth out, because just the way it is, it'd be hard to do this procedure with you awake, because you wouldn't like it. And he freaked out, and they're like, well, no, we just put you under, and then we wake you back up in like 20 minutes, and it'll be fine, and your mouth will feel better. The guy wouldn't do it. He's like, well, what if I don't wake up? They're like, well, you will wake up. And so they got to deal with the breakfast question in the dentist office. The guy wouldn't go along with it. And so instead he just had a rotting mouth, and I think he died. I can't remember if it was from a complication resulting from the tooth. But so what that showed, and I think what the story is meant to show, from what I remember, is, for one, they cared about the people. So it wasn't this like hostility thing, but there were also limits. You run up on the limit of like an 80 IQ or whatever it was in Zimbabwe at the time, where the blacks had, I think, the highest standard of living in the continent in Rhodesia, even compared against South Africa. So they lived relatively well, but they just ran up against limits. So there was this evolution approach where they said, well, the system's fair. Whether you're white or black, you need this amount of property to vote. We're going to keep that intact. That was why they broke from Britain, is because Britain wanted just mass democracy, which, as Ian Smith said, would have been revolution, because it would just meant communism. Someone like Mugabe. But they kind of that was limited, because only so many people succeeded, which was kind of the trouble they ran into. Is they said, well, the system's fair, and then that gets into the per capita question. Well, the UN types would say, well, why aren't there as many blacks voting as whites on a per capita basis? And the Rhodesians would say, well, we tried, but there's only so much you can do. Yeah,
eventually you went into a biology question, or an evolution, not evolution, like time. I really think it was just a matter of time.
Yeah, it probably had it continued for like 2 centuries, or even till now, they probably would have seen something change, and it would have they would have gotten more blacks involved with the a voter list, but they just didn't have enough time. I mean, it only really became a pretty successful place in the early 1900s, only successful enough for independence from a company in 1921. So they're kind of working with what they had, and they tried it, but there wasn't anywhere near enough time for the evolutionary approach to really bear fruit as part of the problem.
Yeah. Okay, let's get into the Bush War. What was the build up to it? What was the big event that caused it? What was the first shot? What was the story here?
There wasn't really a big blow up. I think the first shot was tourists at Victoria Falls were shot at by communists in Zambia, if I remember right. And I think that was in 64. That could have been in 65. But yeah, there wasn't a big explosion that led to this like multi-front war that was a problem. There were a few problems that kind of led to it. One was that, so I mentioned earlier, there's this federation of northern and southern Rhodesia, or Zambia and Zimbabwe for modern terms. Before Rhodesia declared independence, Zambia broke away from it as northern Rhodesia, got the Commonwealth and Britain to let it be independent, and had black majority rule, which was a disaster. They didn't have like Congo style violence, but it was bad for the whites in the country and was kind of a mess. And they got communism. It was wrecked the prosperity for about a decade and a half. Around the same time as that happened, the Congo underwent its cataclysm. So in 61, I think it was 60, it got independence. Then in 61 and 62, there was the Katanga crisis, where the Katanga region, that's kind of in the southeast, tried breaking away from the state as a whole because it was the prosperous area with all the mines and a lot more Belgians. And they're like, well, we don't want to deal with Colonel or Corporal Matubu or whatever, Lumumba, who was the president at the time, because he's a mess. We have this guy named Tashambe, who's much more civilized. He's going to be a good leader. We want him to rule our little province. America chimped out, sent in the UN to go crush that. And then so the Congo remained kind of unified, but a mess. And then right after that, there was the Simba uprising, Simba rebellion in the Congo, where these tribal guys would take a lot of drugs that they thought made the bullets not harm them, and then just massacre civilians and rape them for as long as they could. My Corps' 5 Commando put an end to that and killed them by 65. But it was a mess. Like, it was, if you read the tales from that, it's kind of like watching Africa Audio, where it's just like, it's really sickening just to hear about what they did, particularly the nuns and people like them in the wider areas of the Congo. So the Rhodesians saw that and said, well, there's no way in hell you're getting us to go along with decolonization, because we're not going to be raped and murdered like they were in the Congo. We want to have our own country. But the British at that point, their colonial policy was that they were getting rid of their colonies. And more than that there had to be local majority rule before they would allow independence, which meant black rule in Africa. And so the Rhodesians said no and declared independence unilaterally in November of 65, which is probably when you could pin the start of the war, though there was violence before it. And what happened when they declared independence unilaterally was that because Britain didn't go along with it, Britain wanted to punish them. So as the communists attacked Rhodesia, really all of NATO, though the French and Italians were kind of ended up helping the Rhodesians a little bit during the war by selling them stuff secretly. Other than that, really all of NATO and pretty much the entirety of the world cracked down on Rhodesia and passed in the UN an embargo and sanctions that meant Rhodesia couldn't really export or import anything. There were some ways around it, and there was some smuggling, but really in the whole, the Rhodesians couldn't import or export anything. For a while, they were helped because Portugal still controlled what's now Mozambique, Portuguese East Africa. And there's a port there called Beira, which is kind of the sliver of land the Portuguese control that was on the eastern edge of Rhodesia, and through it they could import oil because Rhodesia is landlocked, so they needed this port at Beira. But that went away in 74 when the Portuguese fell in the Carnation Revolution. But so the kind of situation when the Bush War begins is that the Portuguese control Mozambique, which is, there's fighting inside it. There's already a communist rebellion. But it's kind of going okay. The Portuguese can keep a lid on things, particularly with Rhodesian help. Meanwhile, Zambia is communist for what it's worth at this point, and a lot of refugees have left to the Congo and are trying to get into Rhodesia, particularly whites. But so the rebels, the communist rebels that are going to attack Rhodesia, have set up shop in Zambia because it's the closest, safest host government for them. And they're trying to cross the border and wreak havoc inside Rhodesia from there. And there are two main groups. The Matabele and the Shona don't like each other because of their history. So the Shona under Robert Mugabe are supported by the Chinese, and then the Matabele under Joshua Nkomo are supported by the Soviets. And so those Soviet and Chinese rebels are attacking Rhodesia, and they're kind of aided in doing so by America and the British particularly, but NATO as a whole, by the sanctions that are imposed on Rhodesia and the embargo.
Damn, everyone's humped up on it.
Yeah.
It's like that, I don't normally I don't like referencing memes in a podcast because it's corny, but it is a they hate to see a white man succeed meme. It's just, man, that is tragic. So you said the communists, the Western and Chinese communists were both getting involved. That is, Man, that sucks.
Yeah, it was unideal for them.
Okay, how did the war play out? How long did it last? How were they doing? Was it like from the get go? Was it inevitable they were going to lose? Was there a path to success, victory, or?
Yeah, so that's one of the questions you run into with the Rhodesian Bush War. Is it's kind of like Vietnam in that there wasn't a particularly clear path to success other than some negotiated end, but none of the parties really wanted to negotiate. So the Rhodesian grand strategy, from what I gather, and I'm not a strategist, I am not a military guy, really interested in some military history is the limits of my competence in this. The Rhodesian grand strategy, though, from what I gather, was just trying to keep the rebels out as much as possible and keep Rhodesia internally functioning and without as much havoc, at least as possible, from the communists while the world went through its political changes, in the hope that in America or Britain, but preferably both, there would be more conservative governments that were friendlier to their interests and would either end the embargo and let them import the stuff they needed to fight, or force the communists to back down. That never happened, but it's what they were hoping for. They were trying to buy themselves time for 15 years. So they kind of succeeded in that, but it wasn't quite long enough. So the path to success for them would have been to hold out probably until Reagan. Reagan did aid South Africa, and I'm not a huge booster of him. I think he was a pretty bad president overall. But in terms of Africa policy, he did at least aid the South Africans and fight Congress on that issue. So I think he probably would have helped the Rhodesians had they made it to 81, but they didn't. But so the Bush War generally, there are two stages to it as they try and hold out for as long as they can. The first is from 65 to 74, and this is where two things are in their favor. One is that, as I said, the Portuguese still control Mozambique. So though it's a porous border and there are communists on the other side, the Portuguese are there fighting them, and the Rhodesians, if they want to deal with the communists in Mozambique, can work with Portuguese forces, which means it's not as manpower. It doesn't require as much manpower, and they kind of know what's going on, and it's not as high stakes because it's really the Portuguese doing the fighting. The Portuguese at this point, the conscripts who were sent to Mozambique, and there's a similar fight going on in Angola, weren't that good at fighting and didn't really want to be there. So it was kind of a mixed bag, but it was broadly helpful, and they could import what they needed through Beira. Similarly, because of just the situation, the South Africans were much more on their side in this period than they were later in the war, where the policy of the South African government was to fight communism. So the South African kind of militarized police have been setting up, or would set up on the border and kind of help the Rhodesians in keeping communists out. They sent a good number of arms north, which is where you get the Rhodesian FALs from South Africa that have the armory little stamp cut out, which is why they have the circle missing on the lower receiver. And that's kind of the situation. It's this low-grade, long-running insurgency where the rebels are trying to sneak in from Zambia or sometimes Mozambique and attack the Rhodesians, particularly attack civilian infrastructure like the isolated farms. And the Rhodesians are trying to keep them out, or once they're in the country, eliminate them. And this kind of goes back and forth. The Rhodesians probably had the upper hand in it. They're pretty successful in eliminating terrorists, and the farmers, though they were isolated on these big farms, learned to build bunkers where they could just hide out and fight the communists off while they waited for relief forces, primarily local militia or the British South Africa police, which were the militarized police inside Rhodesia. And that continues till 74.
It sounds like a nightmare, honestly. Yeah. Being in a bunker while people are trying to get inside and kill away people, and you're just waiting for Melissa to show up. It sounds like a nightmare.
It was certainly unideal. I would say, however, like, it's important not to overstate it because it wasn't everywhere. It was some of these outlying farm areas that were more hard hit by this. And the more prosperous internal part of Rhodesia, that kind of central spine that was more temperate, was mostly untouched. Not entirely, and they did fight, but it was life could continue as normal in most of Rhodesia for kind of most of the war. Even if you did have to be on your guard and everyone was armed. So they, like, you know, it's kind of hard to say. It's like, well, what would you be doing if you're a Texas rancher kind of eyeing the cartels right now? Would probably be an apt comparison. But
that's a wide comparison. You said that, and I realized that's a wide comparison. But now that you say it, I'm like, ooh,
yeah,
we might get some very interesting TV shows in 30 years.
Yeah, it's not ideal for sure.
Wow.
Yeah. But so then things change in 74. And so just to note before I continue, that was during the Nixon presidency. So Nixon people seem to like Nixon now for whatever reason. He was awful. He let communism succeed in Africa. He could have just aided the Rhodesians. So he
had some great quotes. That's really it. He had some really funny quotes off the record. And that's it. But besides,
So not a Nixon booster. So then gets into 74. What happened was the Carnation Revolution in Portugal, which is where the socialists, after Salazar died, the socialists kind of took control of the country. It was a mixed bag. One thing they immediately did was give up control of their two remaining colonies, Angola and Mozambique, and just hand them over to the locals. There was no negotiated settlement, really. There wasn't much going on. Just one day the Portuguese said, we're leaving. And within like 3 days, they were all gone and they destroyed everything they could. So they left a mess out of spite, which I find kind of funny. But they're like, yeah, we're leaving. Y'all can go kill yourselves if you want. And they proceeded to kill themselves. It was a mess. In Mozambique, eventually Frelimo was the communist organization that took over. And it hated the Rhodesians because it was communist and there had been all this fighting. So at that point, that really expanded the war dramatically because it meant that instead of Zambia, which was kind of confined to like the northwestern quarter of Rhodesia's border, if that, a huge swath of it was exposed to communist infiltration, really extending down into its southeast all the way from its northwest. So it was really exposed, and there's much wider area over which the communists could infiltrate, which was a big problem because there weren't ever that many Rhodesians. They had a few thousand people in their frontline security units at any given time in the war, plus a few thousand black troops, plus a pretty sizable militia, but militia is what militia is. And so it was kind of their frontline troops trying to keep people out, which if you're defending a country the size of Texas, which effectively Rhodesia is, it's hard to do that with like 6,000 people, particularly when you can't import planes or helicopters. They managed to get like a squad, I think 3 squadrons of planes in during the war from France and like 20 helicopters from Israel. But that was it. So there, and they, besides whatever they had beforehand, which was a few Alouettes, a few Sky Raiders, or not Sky Raiders, a few C-47s, and a few similar planes and attack aircrafts like Canberra bombers. But regardless, that's kind of beyond the point. They were defending this huge border without that many men. That's where you get the Gray Scouts, which are those very aesthetic pictures of men in Rhodesian camouflage on horses with FALs and G3s. Those are the Gray Scouts. Probably the
beautiful aesthetic.
Yeah, extremely awesome aesthetic.
So cool.
But at the point you're defending your border with horsemen in 1975, it's unideal, to say the least. Though it did look cool and work pretty well. They did a good job. The Gray Scouts were effective, but it's just unideal. But so that kind of sets up their war situation, which isn't great. And the war dramatically escalates at that point because so many more communists can attack. So it goes from being a low running insurgency to really a serious, intense conflict like the Vietnam War. Meanwhile, the South Africans saw the Portuguese fall and started getting uneasy, particularly as world opinion continued to support the communists instead of the Rhodesians. And so the South Africans said to themselves effectively, and this is really laid out pretty well in Ian Smith's memoirs, well, our apartheid situation is unpopular amongst the world, to say the least, but we don't want to give it up. And so what we can do is say we're affecting détente in Africa while throwing Rhodesia to the wolves, and hopefully that buys us some time and world opinion will change or just forget to notice us because Rhodesia has been dealt with and that conflict ended. So, which didn't work, but the South Africans thought that to themselves. So they stopped really supplying the Rhodesians with the weapons they needed, stopped sending them, say, bombs for their attack aircraft or more rifles, stopped providing them with the fuel supplies they needed, which was a huge problem because the Rhodesians, after Mozambique fell, couldn't import oil through Beira anymore. So the Rhodesians at that point are surrounded on like 3 sides. Their sole remaining ally, the South Africans, aren't helping them. Though, fun enough, Israel was like the one state that helped them in this period because it was, I think, Rabon was the more like right-wing Israeli leader, and he gave them some weapons and let them produce copies of Israeli weapons, which was helpful, and gave them helicopters, which was also helpful. But so the South Africans were fighting a lot more. This is where you see a lot more of the innovations for which the war is known. For example, there's the V-hull cars they used to travel, whether Land Rovers or more domestic manufacturers, which are important because one of the main tactics of the rebels, other than attacking farmsteads, was planting mines in the roads and hoping civilian cars would blow up when they hit them, which was awful and an atrocity against the rules of war. But the world never condemned the rebels. It only ever condemned the Rhodesians. Mm-hmm. So you see that innovation. Similarly, they had this thing called the golf bomb, which is a pretty clever thermobaric weapon. And some innovations like that, some bowling ball shaped bombs they could drop out of bombers. They succeeded in coming up with some ways to kill communists, but the war just at this point was against them because it was too much. So whites would flee because their farms were being attacked and there wasn't a ton going on, or economically at least there wasn't a ton of opportunity. They managed to stave off inflation and kind of keep infrastructure functioning, but it was certainly under siege. And the war wasn't going great. They managed to kill a lot of communists, certainly, but they didn't really succeed in their other strategic objective of trying to de-escalate things a bit. Because, for example, they're kind of into the 77 range, so a couple of years after Mozambique fell, and they're starting to get desperate because they're running out of supplies because the South Africans won't supply them with what they need. They're starting to launch cross-border raids into Mozambique and into Zambia, which succeeded in killing a lot of communists. There's that famous one, Operation, I think it's Eland, it's ELAND, where a couple Cella Scouts guys in blackface just drove through a rebel training camp and killed 2,000 people. And the rebels never really figured out what was going on. So they're just some insane stories, and they killed a lot of communists. But those raids kind of got the world to focus again on the Rhodesian conflict because they technically crossed the border and attacked a sovereign country. And so it just turned into a mess that turned world opinion even more against them and made it harder for them to succeed. So that was kind of the situation heading into the end of the Bush War, and really 79 was the climactic year. And over all this is presiding Jimmy Carter, who was awful. He and his friend Andy Young, who was a civil rights guy from Atlanta, really tried to turn the screws on Rhodesia because Young saw it as an extension of the civil rights conflict and really wanted to help the communists win because he thought that would be equity.
That's a heel. Well, anyone listening, if you want to hear a great book on this, on the actual fighting, there's a book from A.J. Ballum called Bush War Operator, Memoirs of the Rhodesian Light Infantry and the Silo Scouts and Beyond. It's on Scribd or ever read. I listened to the audiobook. It's very entertaining, very good. If anyone listening, I'll put a link in the description. It's a fun first-hand account of a guy from growing up in Rhodesia and fighting in the Bush War.
Another one like that is Three Sips of Gin by a guy named Tim Bax. He was a Cella Scout, and it's a very fun tale of the war. He was there's some crazy stories in there.
Well, I love gin, so I'm already sold.
Yeah,
I'll have to pick it up. Okay, so we're hitting 1979. We're hitting the end. What was the final straw? What was it? What was the point where these are kind of okay? We have to leave. It's over. What was the last straw?
So at that point, the South Africans had dragged them to a lot of negotiations, and they'd produced an agreement under which the Rhodesians were gonna start handing more control to the blacks in the country. That's how you get this guy named Bishop Merzewa. I can't pronounce his name, but he was a moderate black who they put in power alongside Ian Smith, and they thought that would help shift world opinion in their favor. It didn't really, because Mugabe wasn't in charge, nor were the other communists. So they're fighting at this point an extremely intense war, and they're pretty much out of men because so many people had left because the prospects were looking dim. They thought Thatcher's election in Britain would help them. It didn't. She remained opposed to them, much as the socialist prime minister that preceded her, Harold Wilson, had been. So the Iron Lady is also an evil person during the Cold War. She was awful as well. People shouldn't support Thatcher. But anyway, so as they're running out of men, as they're running out of material, as the South Africans are generally being unhelpful and they have no other real allies, the big issue is that their fuel reserves, which were stored in a couple big tanks in Salisbury, now called Harare, were blown up by communist infiltrators. They kind of managed to get some fuel back, but that really grounded their air force for a while and let the communists get the upper hand. It was a mess, and it was a really big blow to their economy and their war effort. And that was in late 78, early 79, from what I remember. shortly afterward, two big things happened that convinced the civilians to leave, and those two shoot downs of civilian airliners, two Viscount civilian airplanes. So this was Nkomo's men got surface-to-air missiles from the Soviets, which they had been using against Rhodesian military aircraft. But then they set up outside the airport in Salisbury, and there was a civilian flight that would go from Salisbury, Rhodesia, to I forget where in South Africa each day, or most days. And the rebels shot one of them down, shot down a civilian airliner outside Salisbury. And then when it crashed, instead of rescuing the survivors, which they knew at that point certainly to be civilians, they raped and then bayoneted them, including a baby and a pregnant woman. And so that happened once. The Rhodesians showed clearly what had happened. The rebels did it. World opinion, despite that, never once condemned the rebels for shooting down a civilian airliner and murdering the people on it. Instead, you had Andy Young at the UN saying that Nkomo was a peaceful man who only wanted what was best. So it's just like macabre, horrible. A couple months later, the exact same thing happened again. World opinion remained opposed Rhodesia and in support of the communists who were like raping and murdering civilians and had been doing the same to black villagers for years. And so at that point, you really see a large scale exodus, even more so than in previous years, of whites out of Rhodesia, because they were just thought, well, we can't survive here. The world is letting communists commit the worst atrocities against us, and we're not really winning this war, and we're out of oil, so we need to go. So they left, and that really handicapped Rhodesia's security forces, because it meant they didn't, like, there were no more recruits, there were no more reserves, everyone was leaving, the militia was dwindling, there weren't people to replace the people on the front line, they didn't want to have it be an all-black army that might oppose them, so they thought they needed to hand in the towel. And and they eventually did so. They just said, well, we'll have an election with Mugabe who can run, and we'll see what plays out. And that was kind of the end of it. There wasn't a big like cataclysm at the end. It wasn't like the taking of Berlin where there's just this horrible blah. They just kind of threw in the towel because they couldn't win, and they didn't see any help or hope on the horizon. And it's unclear if they would have been able to continue the war effort at that point. Many in the security forces who are still there wanted them to, but they were kind of out of men and material. So there's only so much they could do, and they just ended it in 79, 80.
It's just tragic. It's just sad. How did Rhodesia become known as Zimbabwe? What was the whole deal with the name? Like, what's the history there?
So the Grand Zimbabwe ruins are this collection of stones that they claim used to be a very thriving city in what's now Zimbabwe, and it's kind of like Stonehenge, but it could have been buildings instead of just been clock or whatever Stonehenge is. Mm-hmm. It's unimpressive. It's just some rocks. But it became the thing where they said, well, this is the ruins of a grand civilization. It's the Grand Zimbabwe ruins. And the communist blacks latched onto that and wanted to call the country Zimbabwe because of the Zimbabwe ruins, which is very apt because Zimbabwe is the ruins of Rhodesia, which is interesting enough. But so that's how it got its name. And so in 79, when Muzorewa, however you say his name, was put in charge, in a relatively free and fair election that included everyone, it changed the name to Zimbabwe Rhodesia. But then in 1980, Mugabe took over by sending out his terrorists to torture and murder villagers who didn't vote for him, which naturally ended in his victory. So then when he became prime minister, he changed the country's name to Zimbabwe.
Okay, I got a few more questions. Did most of the Rhodesians who were leaving, the white Rhodesians who left, did they tend to congregate in a similar spot, or they kind of just go everywhere? You know, was there like a spot they all go to Australia or something? Like, was there a spot they kind of like collectively went to, or was they all kind of just scatter?
My impression is that while the war was still going on, they mainly left for South Africa so that they could get back to Rhodesia if they wanted. After the war was a mixed bag. A lot went to South Africa. Tim Bax, for example, did so. A great many went to New Zealand and Australia. I haven't really been able to find out why, other than that both are known for their farming and they were a bit part of the Commonwealth, so it was somewhat similar to Rhodesia, but I don't know. I don't really know why. And some went to America, and then also some went to Zambia, which at that point, still was unideal, but was better than Mugabe's Zimbabwe, particularly in the 80s. So they kind of left for Zambia and had mixed results there.
Okay. Well, after all this violence, all this bloodshed, all this everything that went on, is Zimbabwe a nice place now? Is it a good place to move to? Should I pack my bags?
No, it was a disaster. So in the 80s, you got
really,
yeah, shockingly. So in the 80s, you got the genocide of the Ndebele. So Mugabe was a Shona, and because of the colonial and pre-colonial history, the Shonas and the Ndebeles hated each other. So he, when he was in charge, just murdered as many of them as he could, using both North Korean soldiers and some of his soldiers who were trained by North Koreans. Yeah, so the North Koreans, being allied to the Chinese, got involved more after the war than during it, but they were involved in propping up Mugabe in the 80s and helped him kill the Ndebele. After that, things were okay for whites who remained in the country. Very unideal, but okay through the 80s into the mid-90s. Because during that time, the British remained involved with Zimbabwe as an ex-colony. Particularly, they were willing to pay for any expropriation. So during this time, the Zimbabwean state had laws on the books that it generally abided by, that if it were to take white-owned land for the purpose of giving it to the blacks, which was ridiculous because in the 60s, the Duke of Montrose, who was in charge of the agricultural department, whatever it was called for Ian Smith, had set aside about half the farmland in the country for the blacks if they wanted to farm it. They had poor results from it, but it was available for them if they wanted it. So this was taking all the land that wasn't that and handing it to blacks. But it was on a pretty small scale because the British were paying for it. And so the Zimbabweans went along with the court process, which was kind of slow and didn't really happen. But then that exploded in the 90s because Mugabe's veterans were mad because they had been promised land that they didn't get. So first Mugabe said he was going to pay them off. And I think I'm remembering this right. So first he said he was going to pay them off. And so he gave them all like 40,000 Zimbabwean dollars or something like that, which wasn't a lot of money because of inflation. And kind of through this era, there was persistent low double-digit, high single-digit inflation. And so it wasn't that much, but it was a lot for Zimbabwe. So the state went broke, which necessitated money printing. And the British decided that they were going to get uninvolved because they were tired of paying millions of dollars to Mugabe and Zimbabwe because it was a mess. So the whites who had remained were really the ones who had turned it into what was known as the breadbasket of Africa, because during the war they switched from tobacco to grain because they had to feed the country and they couldn't import food because of the sanctions and embargo. So they became grain farmers and were as successful in that as they were in tobacco. So after the war, there's some switch back to tobacco, but also grain remains. It's mainly whites doing the successful farming. Then in the 90s, as I mentioned, the situation explodes. So Mugabe starts confiscating that land without without compensation by the late 90s, early 2000s, and handing it to his troops because he can't pay them anymore because the state's broke. So all at the same time, you have this big confluence of just disaster where on one hand, they can't grow anything now because all the land, and by 2013, it was every white farm in Rhodesia had been taken from the whites and given to the blacks. So all the farms are unsuccessful now because the people to whom they were handed didn't know how to grow anything. So famine strikes because nothing's grown. Like agricultural produce and labor fell by some insane double-digit percentage. It's like 70% from what I remember. It's something just like astounding. And at the same time as that, the state's broke and isn't exporting anything anymore. And as I mentioned, Rhodesia's economy was really built around tobacco exports, and to a lesser extent, mineral and manufactured good exports. So they're not earning any foreign currency or foreign exchange, so they can't buy anything abroad and import it. Nor can they pay their foreign currency denominated debts. So all at the same time in the 2000s, you get hyperinflation as they print money to pay for things. And it is astounding hyperinflation. It's like those $100 trillion notes that weren't worth toilet paper, paired with famine because they're not growing anything or importing anything. So it was just a disaster. It really wrecked Zimbabwe. Okay.
One more question before we got to go into the very end of it. Do you have any idea what the religious makeup was like of Rhodesia? I imagine there are English people coming over. I imagine Anglican, maybe some Catholic.
Yeah, I think it was mainly Anglican amongst the whites. some lower churches, but I think mainly Anglican is what I've gathered.
Did the Anglican Church say anything, or do you know if they had any opinion or information?
The Archbishop of Canterbury during the war was firmly on the side of the communists.
Ah,
yeah,
come on,
yeah.
Cysts. Oh.
And
I don't expect much from the Anglicans. I'm Catholic. I don't expect much from them, but even this, come on.
Yeah. And then the blacks, I think some are Christian and some were animist, and most are just kind of. It was a communist government, and atheism was a part of that, so it's kind of post-colonial Africa religion-wise for the blacks, which is to say, just not really much, and whatever there is a disaster.
Okay. Well, this is the question a friend of mine asked when I was explaining Rhodesia to him. He said, is there anything that can be done for Rhodesia, or is Rhodesia, like other great empires and countries, just gone forever?
Actually, at this point, it's not the worst place in Africa, shockingly. So in 2017, Mugabe was deposed by the military because the country was a wreck. I think it's still a military government there. They've nominally had elections, but it's the military is in control. He died in 2019. And kind of since 2017, which also coincided with Trump's first presidency, and whatever the flaws of his first presidency, he did draw attention to the farm murders in South Africa. And through that, attention was raised about what was going on in Zimbabwe. So in 2017, I think under some pressure from the Trump administration, they started letting white farmers come back in who wanted to come back. Which worked out better than you'd expect, because as I mentioned earlier, there wasn't really white-black hostility amongst the actual people in Rhodesia, like there wasn't, say, the Congo or South Africa. So the locals were more or less excited to see the white farmers who returned, because it meant that they'd have jobs again and there'd be some food grown. So a few thousand white farmers have returned since then. The government also agreed to pay those whose land was expropriated. We'll see if that happens, but they agreed to do it, I think, at the end of 2024. And in 2023, Miss Zimbabwe was white, a white woman, which just checks out, but was funny.
Funny.
So it'd be hard to invest a large sum of money in Zimbabwe because of how things turned out.
Yeah.
However, if you were, say, a former Rhodesian still in Africa, or the son of a former Rhodesian still in Africa, it would probably make sense to move there from South Africa. I think, because the relation between you and your laborers is going to be far, far better than it would be in South Africa. There's not that hostility. You kind of know the area. It's very fertile, and like anything above what it was in, say, 2014 is an improvement. So yeah, it's for what can be done. It's hard to imagine another pioneer column taking it over again, and there are a lot more natives there now than there used to be. Eben Barlow or Eric Prince or someone like them could certainly do so. It wouldn't be very difficult, at least in terms of making the operation a success, though you would want to make sure it has ocean access this time. But that's not going to happen, probably. And so in terms of what to do to help, drawing attention to it, I think, is the best thing, because that keeps the government friendly towards the whites, so it can get some foreign aid, if any, or at least get people back that have a functioning economy. And other than that, I don't really think there's a ton that can be done, unfortunately.
Okay, so keep making the memes, boys. Keep making the memes. Meme power is very real. Okay, well, it's been a fantastic episode. I've learned a lot. For the listeners, where should they go if they wanted to learn more? What books do you recommend? Podcasts, essays, that kind of stuff. Where do you recommend people go?
So for essays, I write about that a good bit on my site, theamericantribune.news. I hate to promote myself immediately, but there's not really a ton of writing about Rhodesia in article form that's not either slop or just libtard coded about how awful it was. So you can do that if you want articles. There aren't really any good documentaries about it that I found. Africa Audio is a good one about decolonization, and Empire of Dust is about the Congo and its just disastrous state. And those are good if you like documentaries, but they're not about Rhodesia, and neither of them touch on Rhodesia. For books, there are a great many that are good. The one I recommend the most is The Great Betrayal by Ian Smith. It is expensive. The Abe Books is probably the best place to get it. Kind of consistently has it for the least expensive, around $90 for a paperback version. It's hard to find and somewhat expensive, but it is extremely good, and just packed full of content and information. And
I've tried to find a free copy online or Libsyn something for, but I can't. It's a struggle.
There's a Kindle copy if you go to the Goodreads page for The Great Betrayal and click the buy Kindle link. There is a Kindle version you can access that way. Okay. I don't remember how much it is, but it's like far less than whatever the paperback version is. And I think it's like an actual Kindle copy that works instead of kind of being like a PDF you download to Kindle. It's always a mess. Yeah. Mm-hmm. But I just found the paper copy kind of before it was popular, so not as big of a deal. So I'd recommend that one most of all, just because it really tells the political story and kind of how Rhodesia was betrayed consistently very well. Some other books that are good, 3 Sips of Gin by Tim Bax is very good. It's about the Sela Scouts. A Handful of Hard Men is quite good. It's about the Rhodesian SAS. Fire Force by Chris Cox is one of the most famous ones about the war. I didn't find it particularly good. Cox was something of a liberal from what I gather. And also it was about the very end of the war. And it's just, he certainly was a very brave man and fought well. And the book has some good stories, but it's not as good of a book as some of the others. There are 2 about the Rhodesian Air Force that are quite good. One is called A Pride of Eagles, and the other is called, let me just check. Winds of Destruction. They're both nominally about the Rhodesian Air Force, but really tell the whole story of Rhodesia and the story of the Bush War very, very well. So though there is some focus on the Air Force and some of the like personal parts in Winds of Destruction isn't as interesting because the guy was just like a very functional Anglo. So there's not like a ton of great stories. He's like a very good guy, which makes the book not as exciting as if he was a pirate, but it's a extremely good both are extremely good histories of how the war played out, the political changes during it, the different engagements, the kind of general situations. They're very good. So they're not only about the Air Force, but really great histories of the country and of the fight. There's a book called Don't Let's Go to the Dogs Tonight by Alexandria Fuller. She was a girl during the war. Her farm was never attacked, but they always had to be on alert for it. And she kind of moved around post-colonial Africa after the war. So it's also interesting. It's a good civilian perspective one.
That sounds very interesting.
Yeah, it's really good. Let me just see if there are any more I recognize that would be good. Those are probably the main ones. There are always other books you can read, and there's some I'm working through that are great. Those are the ones I would start with, and you can kind of see from there what like Amazon recommends or the other ones recommended in those books that are good. But I would start there. Okay.
Well, Will, this has been a great episode. Thank you so much for coming on. Where can people find you at? What are your plugs?
Yeah, so on Twitter, I'm at Will_Tanner_1. On Spotify, I have a podcast called The Old World, where we mainly talk about the English and decolonization and stuff like that. And then I have a Substack where I write about stuff like this in longer form. It's theamericantribune.news. It's kind of longer form essays on these subjects.
Fantastic. Well, man, thanks for coming on. It's been great, everyone. Thanks for listening. Have a good night.
Thank you.